Permit me to label the message, The Rich Fool. The Rich Fool. Imagine you lived in the days of Jesus. You got the chance to see and hear the ministry of Jesus in person. Somehow, you finagle your way to the front of a large crowd, close enough to speak to Jesus. What would you say or ask in that moment? That scenario is the occasion of our text. Verse 13 says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." In Jewish custom, the oldest son was the heir of the father's estate, the executor of the father's will, and the recipient of the lion's share of the father's wealth. The man in our text most likely is the younger son who comes to Jesus because he feels he is either being deprived of his inheritance or he wants more than his rightful share. So he brought the matter to Jesus to receive justice or vengeance. And notice how he comes to Jesus. Rather than humbly requesting the Lord's wise counsel, he orders Jesus to do his bidding. Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Verse 14 records Jesus' response. Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? Man, that term of address indicates that he was a stranger to Jesus. He didn't know Jesus, Jesus didn't know him. And note the question, if I could paraphrase. What do I look like, Judge Wapner? What do you think this is? The people's court? The rhetorical question Jesus raises in verse 14 is an emphatic refusal to get involved. He refused to get involved, not because the request was outside of his sovereign authority. He refused to get involved because the request was outside of his redemptive purpose. Leon Morris comments here. He came to bring men to God, not property to man. So Jesus refused to get involved in this family and financial dispute. Instead, he used it as a teachable moment for his disciples. Verse 15 says, and he said to them, take care. Be on guard against all covetousness. Take care is a stern warning. It means take heed, watch out, beware. Be on guard is military language. It means to defend yourself, to be ready to defend yourself against the threat or attack of an enemy. What threat demands such solemn language? Covetousness. What's covetousness? It's lost lingo in the lexicon of the contemporary church. We don't treat covetousness as a matter of spiritual warfare as Jesus presents it here, but God thought that covetousness is such a serious issue that he included it in the 10 Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 17 says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." But don't let that those references to your neighbor confuse you. Covetousness is more than envy or jealousy. It's something much worse. It's greed. An insatiable desire for more. Colossians chapter 3, verse 5 calls covetousness idolatry. And so it is. Covetousness is thing worship. So Jesus warns us to be on guard against, watch the language, all covetousness. This is not a sin you can afford to play with in the least. Be on guard against all covetousness. Verse 15 explains why. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. I'm trying to rush through this verse in the introduction. I want to spend the body of the sermon on the parable Jesus tells. But this 15th verse deserves a whole sermon by itself. In fact, that final line is a truth we should constantly remind ourselves. Your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. We are human beings, not human havers. You are more than what you have. Somebody needs to hear that today. Let me say it again. You are more than what kind of car you drive. You are more than what neighborhood you live in. You are more than where you graduated from school. You are more than what kind of work you do. You are more than the labels on the clothes you are wearing. You are more than how much money you have in the bank. Your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. But the danger of covetousness is that it causes us to embrace a false and faulty definition of life. It so disorientates us that we become confused about what real life really is. So Jesus says, let me paraphrase it this way: fight materialism with all your might. Can I just ask you, I got to move on. Who else will talk to us this way? Everywhere else in the world, media, advertisement, magazines, celebrities feed our materialism. If if you go here, if you buy that, if you have the other, then you'll really be alive. Jesus says if you want to guard your life, you need to fight materialism with all your might. And then he tells us why. I'm going to walk you through the parable, but if I can summarize the point of the parable in one statement, it would be this: you cannot live for God if you live in greed. You do not live for God if you live in greed. Jesus makes this point emphatically in the parable of the rich fool. What does this parable teach us about life and death and eternity? I want you to see it just by walking you through the story. And I want to do so under two headings. This parable is a parable about life and death. Consider first with me the life of a wealthy man. The life of a wealthy man. The main character of this parable is called the rich fool, because he had a bad solution to a good problem. Let me show you both. Let's start with the good problem. His good problem is twofold. First, this is the problem that starts it all. He has a plentiful harvest. Verse 16 says, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. A rich man's land produced a bumper crop. The text doesn't tell us, but I believe it's safe to assume that the man was rich because he worked hard. He tilled the soil, he planted the seed, he cultivated the crop, and his hard work paid off with a great harvest. But would you notice in the language of the text, Jesus doesn't give him credit for any of this. And rightfully so. First of all, his land wasn't his land. Psalm 24 says the earth is the Lord's, the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. His land was not really his land. Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 through 19, the ground is cursed because of Adam's sin. And God tells Adam, because of your sinfulness, you will work hard. You'll work, he says, by the sweat of your brow, but the ground won't cooperate. You can work really hard, and all it produces is thorns and thistles. That didn't happen to this man. Why? Because he was so good? No. It didn't go that way for this man because the Lord was good to him. The Lord blessed this rich man's land to produce plentifully. If you don't get that point, you'll miss everything else in the text. The Lord did it. And I want to say that to you. What you have, God gave you. What you know, God taught you. Where you are, God brought you. God did it. The man has a plentiful harvest, which leads to the other part of his good problem, the limited storage. Verse 17 says, the rich man thought to himself, what shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crop. The bumper crop created a dilemma for the rich man. He reaped so much grain that his barns were not big enough to store it all. That's a good problem to have. Or is it? The question, what shall I do, indicates more than his confusion about his space problems. It expressed great anxiety over his storage problems. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 22 says, "The blessing of the Lord makes a man rich, and he adds no sorrow to it." So what if you got a lot of stuff but can't sleep at night? Need to take something to go to bed, need to take something to get up. When the Lord blesses a man, he not only blesses you with the stuff, but he gives you peace of mind. But this rich man's blessing became a curse because of self-centeredness. This is not a dilemma. This is very easy. This is very easy situation to address. He started loading up the harvest till he packed out all his barns. He could have just simply gave some away. He could have helped the needy and still been rich. Ambrose said it well. The bosoms of the poor, the houses of widows, the mouths of children are the barns which last forever. But this answer doesn't seem to have crossed the rich man's mind. He was worrying about what to do about this limited storage for his plentiful harvest. He had a good problem, but a bad solution. His solution is in verses 18 and 19. It's a twofold solution. First, he plans a construction project. Verse 18, and he said, "I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I will store all my grain and my goods." Lay your eyes on the text. I want you to see it for yourself. Note the personal pronouns he uses in this monologue. I will do this. I will tear down. I will store. And then note not just the personal pronouns, notice the possessive pronouns. My barns, my grain, my goods. This rich man held an executive meeting with his board of directors. Me, myself, and I. And his board gave him the solution to the problem. He will tear down these barns and build larger ones. Do you see how warped this man's thinking is? He didn't just say, "I'll expand my current barns," or "I'll build new ones beside them." He says, "I'm going to tear down all the barns I already have and then build larger barns." And assuming the successful completion of this construction project, he would store all of his grain and all of his goods. This rich fool is the ancient prototype of the American dream that says, get all you can all you get, and then sit on the can so you don't have to share it with nobody else. Not only notice his construction project, would you notice his retirement plan? Verse 19. When I finish building these larger barns, I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. In a perverse soliloquy, this rich man started talking to his own soul. He congratulated himself for having ample goods laid up for many years. There would be so much grain stored up in the new, larger barns that he would never have to work again. Think about it. He could tell his boss, take this job and shove it. He could buy all the things he wants. He could travel to all of the exotic vacation spots he dreamed of. He can fulfill all of the items on his bucket list. Listen to how he describes it. I'll relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Hear me, Shiloh. This verse is the closest the Bible ever gets to addressing what we call retirement. And here, this notion of retirement is presented as the path to a wasted life. R. Kent Hughes said the problem with this man's retirement plan is that it was a ticket to hedonism. Eat, drink, and be merry is a biblical idiom for a decadent, sinful life of debauchery. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 32 says it this way: if the dead are not raised, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. If that's true, friends, if that's true, if it's true that when you die, you're done, if that's true, then this man's plan is the way you ought to live. Party. Party as long as you can, party as much as you can. But I want to warn you, that's not how life works. Hebrews 9:26 tells us how life works. It is appointed to a man to die once, and then comes the judgment. It is not true that when you die, you are done. When you die, you will have to answer to God for how you have lived your life. Which gets us to the second movement of this parable. The bulk of the parable shows us the life of a wealthy man, and then it shifts to show us the death of a foolish man. Have you seen that old bumper sticker that says, the one with the most toys at the end wins? Here's my question. Wins what? The one with the most toys at the end still dies. You can't take any of those toys with you. Life is like a game of Monopoly. It don't matter how big you winning, how long you play, how much money you get, how much property you acquire. At some point, the game is over. And all that money and all that property, you got to give it all back. And all of it is put in a box, and the box is put away. So the passage ends with two big lessons for us to remember. Lesson one is that your time on earth is limited. Your time on earth is limited. Up to this point, the rich man is not only the main character of the parable, he's the only character in the parable. Lay your eyes on verse 20. This is the big turning point of the parable. Verse 20 introduces a new character to the parable. God. And a lot of times in the parables of Jesus, when Jesus wants God to speak in the parable, he makes God one of the characters in the parable, be it a king or a master or a nobleman or a father or a shepherd. But here, to show the futility of this rich man's life, Jesus casts God in a cameo appearance as God. The rich man has had much to say in this parable, but God has the last word. God speaks to give the final verdict. Verse 20, but God said to him, fool. Can you imagine how shocked that cat must have been? That's not how he's used to being addressed. The media called him a success story. Society called him a mover and a shaker. His colleagues called him a trailblazer. God called him a fool. A damned fool. He was a fool in the Old Testament sense of the term. He had no spiritual wisdom, no spiritual discernment, no spiritual understanding. Psalm 14, verse 1, Psalm 53, verse 1 are parallel verses. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The rich man was not a fool because he earned and planned and saved and enjoyed his wealth. He was a fool because he allowed his wealth to cause him to think and speak and act and plan and live as if there is no God. So the parable of the rich fool is a cautionary tale. You can be wise before man and a fool before God. You can be rich among men and poor toward God. You can be a smashing success with man and a horrible failure with God. Don't play the fool. Because the final verdict will lead to the death sentence. The rich man was a fool because he didn't know how to tell time. In verse 19, he said to himself, "You have ample goods laid up for many years." In verse 20, God told him, "This night your soul is required of you." While establishing an investment plan that would lead to financial security for years to come, he never factored in the possibility that he might not live to see the years to come. Do you know that? But you got all these big plans for your life. You do know you might not live to tear down those barns and build bigger barns. You might not live long enough to relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Wait a minute. You may not live to see the sun come up in the morning. James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15 says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." Life is brief, life is fragile, and life is out of your control. Every single one of us will very soon be either bones in a box or ashes in an urn. And I say this with pastoral love. You are playing the fool if that's shocking news to you. Every time you turn on the news, death is saying to you, "I'm coming for you soon." When you pass that tragic accident on the highway, death is saying to us, "And I'm coming for you soon." Every time you hear about a family or a friend or a loved one who died, death is trying to say to you, "And I'm coming for you soon." Every time you hear about fires and floods and tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes, death is trying to tell you, "I'm coming for you. Get your house in order." But we are so busy surrounding ourselves with toys that we can't see reality. May the Lord help each of us to daily pray the prayer of Moses in Psalm 90, verse 12. "So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom." Let me show you one more thing in verse 20. There's the final verdict, there's the death sentence, and then the verse ends with the probate estate. This is the master teacher at work. God condemns the rich man as a fool. He announces that this rich fool would die that very night. Now, in the order of things, the next step would be for God to send that man to hell. That's what happens in Luke 16 in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. But there's no mention of hell here. Instead, God asked him a question at dying time. "And all this stuff you done stored up, whose will it be?" This question reveals how dangerous covetousness is to the soul. The threat of hell does not frighten the heart that is in love with money and the things that money can buy. It's more concerned about what will happen to what they have when they die. And so God says, since your mind is so on your stuff, let me ask you about your stuff. These things you have prepared, whose will they be? There are two pieces of bad news here. Do you see them? You cannot take any of it with you when you die. And you can't even say what will happen to it when you die. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. The preacher says, I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will be the master of all the things for which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. It's vanity, empty, useless, worthless, to waste your life accumulating things that cannot save, that cannot secure, and cannot satisfy. Some decades ago, Jim Elliot and a small team of missionaries went to Ecuador to spread the gospel. They were savagely murdered by cannibals. His young widow took Elliot's memoirs and published them, including a line that he wrote in his journal just a few days before he died. The line is this: Jim Elliot said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." Your time on earth is limited. That's verse 20, but verse 21 adds another truth. Your treasures on earth are limited. Many of the parables of Jesus are open-ended. The story ends without a conclusion because Jesus wants the hearer to wrestle with the meaning of the parable for yourself. But here Jesus says, I'm not going to let you try to figure out what I'm trying to say. Let me give you the conclusion of this parable. Verse 21, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. The text is not about the man that told Jesus to make his brother divide the inheritance with him. The text is not about the rich fool. The text is about you and me. Let me be clear about something. Jesus is not condemned laying up treasures for yourself. It's an inevitable fact of life. Each of us is laying up treasure for ourselves. We work, we gain, we spend, we plan, we save. It's just a fact of life. And that process is not a dispassionate one. The word treasure indicates what you accumulate and your attitude toward it. Let me try it this way. You lay up treasure and then treasure what you lay up. And for the record, Jesus doesn't condemn that. He condemns the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21 says it this way: do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where a man's treasure is, there will his heart be also. A king set sail in a fleet of ships to go on a diplomatic mission. His host honored him with a vest made of silver and gold. The bejeweled vest was so heavy that it was meant to be displayed, not worn. But the gift so swelled the king's pride that he determined to wear the golden vest home. But on the way home, his ship was wrecked at sea. And everyone had to swim to safety. The king refused to take off his golden vest and drowned in the water. Do you get it? Let me try it another way. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? Or what in the world can a man give in exchange for his soul? Would you imagine, this guy was a shrewd businessman. Imagine this rich fool negotiated with God that night. Would half of his wealth stave off death? Could giving his entire estate save him? No. And that's what Jesus is saying. Don't live your life preoccupied with things that can't help you at dying time. So is the one lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Again, I wish I had a whole sermon's worth of time to lean into that statement. But let me just suffice it to ask you. I hope you'll wrestle with this question in the private chambers of your own praying ground. Are you rich toward God? What does it mean to be rich toward God? How can a person become rich toward God? Matthew chapter 5, verse 3 says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be rich toward God, you must first be poor in spirit. You must confess your spiritual bankruptcy before God. God created all of us, and each of us will answer to God for how we have lived our lives. We will have to give an account for our lives. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And there is nothing we can do or say or give to make ourselves right with God. But God sent his only begotten Son. His name is Jesus. He lived a righteous life. He died at the cross for your sins and for mine. And he rose from the dead to give us new life. What kind of new life? 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9 says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, so that we through his poverty might become rich." You want to fight off greed? You want to be rich toward God? Run to the cross while you can. There was a wealthy Roman who had a foolish and rebellious son who was an embarrassment to his father. But this wealthy Roman also had a faithful servant named Marcellus. Because his rebellious son was such a prodigal, the father decided that he did not deserve to receive the estate as an inheritance. And so his will gave instructions to leave the entire estate to his loyal servant, Marcellus. But out of mercy to his son, the will permitted the rebellious son to select one thing in the estate to take and keep as his own. Hearing this, the son replied, Give me Marcellus. Church, that's the scandal of amazing grace. None of us deserve God's favor. None of us deserve God's kindness. None of us deserve God's goodness. But I got good news for you. If you choose Jesus, you get it all. Do you hear me? If you choose Jesus, you get it all. Getting dressed for church this morning, I was thinking about when I was a boy. My mother taught me and my little sister. I was like 5 or 6. That makes my little sister 3 or 4. My mother taught us a song, and on Sunday mornings, she would stand us up in a chair next to the organ and have us to sing this song. I was thinking about this morning. I couldn't believe, looking back on it, that we were singing this song, this testimonial song that neither one of us as children understood, but we regularly sang. And I'm glad I can look back now and say this song is my testimony. The song, the little chorus says, some folk would rather have houses than land. Some folk choose silver and gold. These things they cherish and forget about their souls. But I decided to make Jesus my choice. And the chorus says this: the road gets rough, the going gets tough, and the hills are hard to climb. But I started out a long time ago, and there is no doubt in my mind, I decided to make Jesus my choice. Is that your testimony today? I decided to make Jesus my choice, because when you choose Jesus, you get it all. Glory be to God for his word.